on. We're in the home of Laurie Joe Deal. That's his real name. We call him Joe Deal. He's been Joe Deal for many years. I've known Joe since the 50s when I was at the Atomic Energy Commission. And we are taking Joe for the History Committee of the Health Physics Society at the behest of Sidney Porter, who's the chair of that committee. This is March 22nd, 2001. Both of us have retired from the government. They're long careers, and Joe's is much longer than my own. He started in 1944, but I remember him from when I met him in 1950s, when he helped Bob Corsby quite a bit. He was the chief administrator of the research program out in Nevada test sites and civil defense research, and a member of the distinguished biology and medicine division we were in together in the late 50s. So we like to get his history for the committee. He's had many different experiences. He worked at the upper levels of the Atomic Energy Commission, and he knows a lot of the great people who come his way as he progressed through his career. So we were very pleased that you're willing to be interviewed like this, Joe, and I'll let you do most of the talking. I think it might be well if we started in time. You have to have some sequence. Going back to your boyhood, and then telling us what things led you in the pathway that led you to this career, and along the way, those people who inspired you, whom you would like to mention in your family or otherwise. So I'll let you go ahead, Joe, and thank you very much.
All right. Well, I was born in North Carolina, a town called Hickory. I went to high school, grade school and high school there, and graduated from high school in 1941, just before the war started. I had a goal of my own to be an electrical engineer, and I had always liked to fiddle with electronic stuff to some extent. And with the war coming on, it was, when I was a 16-year-old, it was obvious that you wouldn't get to follow your career probably all the way through, but and I had the unfortunate experience that we had a family problem. My father died early, so I couldn't enter electrical engineering school as I had hoped to do. But we had a very fine college in Hickory called Lenore Ryan College, which was a small school, but it was well attended, supported locally. And it was there that I met my mentor and later boss, Dr. Carl Z. Morgan. And I was studying physics and math because I was hoping to go on to engineering school, take a couple of years at Lenore Island, and then transfer into North Carolina State. That didn't quite work the way I had planned. I did have a chance to spend the summer at NC State, but by then war was on. It was obvious that, well, you'd have to be there. I think engineering at that time was a 5-year course, and I didn't want to wait that long. We all had accelerated schedules, as you recall. So I ended up going back to Lenore and graduating, and I finished my coursework in 1944 in the fall after going through the summer sessions. And a few weeks before I had was called from K.Z. Morgan, and he was in Tennessee. I knew he was in Tennessee, and he wanted to know if I wanted to come over and work for him. So naturally, that was what I was like to do and wanted to do. So I got on the train and went to Knoxville and ended up in Oak Ridge. And I joined the Health Physics Division, which was at that time something I'd never heard of, and it looked like we were in I don't know how to call it. I guess it's almost like Jules Verne. When I got there, I was met Casey, and he explained what the division was and what we were doing. And he took me, I remember taking the tour of the reactor, which was operating pretty much, it was the largest reactor at that time in the country. And of all people who took me there was Jack Healy, who many of you may know. And Jack was one of a number of DuPont engineers who were in Oak Ridge being trained to move on to Hanford. He hadn't gone yet. There were a couple others, Maury Patterson, and was one of them. The two I remember most, and two I remember mostly were Maury and Jack, but there were a couple others around.
Great health physicist.
Yeah, they all were studying health physics. Carl, the program started, of course, at the University of Chicago, as you probably know, under Herbert Parker. And Carl Morgan was his deputy and was responsible for running the training school. So when they transferred to Oak Ridge, Parker stayed there, I don't know how long, because he had just left Oak Ridge and gone to Hanford, and Carl was now the head of the division. But Carl had run a school for all these engineers who ended up in the health physics field in Hanford. And my assignments there were to deal with working with instrumentation, and we had, that was a pretty crude thing in those days compared to what they have now. We had Geiger counters, which had a lot of drawbacks, but they were very well known to Carl because of his experience in cosmic ray work. And he
had portable Geiger counter.
Well, they had developed some portables then. As Carl was doing research in when he was at Lenoir in cosmic ray work. And in fact, he had a place in the mountains of North Carolina that he was measuring some cosmic rays. And he had the circuits, the flip-flop circuits that are now used in a lot of things, including computer systems, were used. He had a flip-flop circuit for his Geiger counters there in the lab. And we did know what a counter was, and we didn't know what it was for. And they were using the other instrumentation they had available was the ionization chambers that were used mostly by the medical profession. My main assignment in the beginning was to keep these instruments calibrated so that the health physics guys in the field who worked side by side with the chemists and the engineers and the construction guys would have calibrated instruments. And we had a shack down on the end of the lab property where we had some radium sources, and we picked up the instruments every week and carried them down and calibrated them, and in some cases repaired them, but not very much. That was basically the job for the instrument. They did have an instrument division at the lab that became very famous in its way. They developed a lot of the early instrumentation. And I did that work for quite a while.
Did you work for Doyle Davis?
Those guys came in later. All they came in later. Right at the end of the war, they had a problem that developed at the Mound Laboratory, which was at that time super secret, and nobody was supposed to know what the hell they did up there. And the fellow that was running the personnel monitoring program was an Army tech sergeant, as were a lot of the guys working in the program. And he was yanked out one afternoon and told he would be stationed in Mound the next day or the next week. So he left, and I took over the personnel monitoring program. And in addition to some of the calibration work, but we had some people helping us by that time. And I ran the personnel monitoring program for Carl in the lab for a number of for quite a while.
Was Joe Cheka there in those days?
Joe Cheka was there.
Have you worked out the neutron film monitoring method?
He did some of that. I did some of that. Some of the early work. I did some of the early reading of it. Worked out the neutron using the track film work. We did the first part before that.
Who introduced the neutron film? Could it have been KZ since he did Cosmic Ray?
No, they didn't do it. I don't know who introduced it, but it was when I got into it. Carl wanted me to do some calibrations on it, and so I helped set up the. We took the films up to the reactor, got them exposed, and took them out and processed them, and we counted the tracks, and we set up the scheme for counting so many tracks equals so many neutrons and so forth.
How did you know how the dose was? What did you use the primary?
Well, they used foils, different foils, indium and gold, and particularly I've forgotten what else. The way it was it wasn't very sophisticated operations.
Had Walter Snyder worked out the?
No, Walter wasn't there.
Walter
didn't. No, Walter came in later.
Later on, he published a handbook.
None of those guys were there. They didn't come in until much later.
You were before them, even.
Yes. And I stayed there. Then after the war, we got one of our major experiences, which I remember, was Carl was asked to go lead a group of people that went out to the first weapons tests in the Pacific at Bikini, when the Navy, the Air Force was going to sink the Navy, and so they were saying that they didn't need a Navy anymore because the Air Force could do everything. So they assembled a group of ships in Bikini Lagoon and dropped a couple bombs. They dropped one bomb and an air burst. And then later they had an underwater burst where they put the bomb on the bottom of the lagoon and blew up the ships. And we went out for the second shot and spent a few months, about a month I think out there, which was quite an experience for me because I was a young kid. And Carl had 9 people from the lab, I think, and I can't remember all of them, but Joe Checker did go on that trip. And it was, Art Snell, who was later became head of the thermonuclear division in Oak Ridge, and Sullivan, H. Sullivan. I don't know whether you know the isotope chart. H. Sullivan. He was those three, and us and Joe, and I've forgotten who the other 2 were. But that was quite an experience. We got, I'd never seen a 4-engine airplane, literally, until we boarded it in Washington, D.C. to go to the Pacific. They had some problems with the reservations because Truman screwed around with the schedule, and we had to go faster than we had planned, and we couldn't get air schedules out of Oak Ridge, so they sent us to Washington on a train. The next morning, we left and went to on a military flight to California. Spent the night in California, and then we got on the plane and went to Hawaii, and went on to Johnson Island and Kwajalein, and from there we flew up on a Navy seaplane up to Bikini.
Long trip in those days.
Oh yeah, it was a long trip, and it was all military. None of us, except the Checker who was in the Army with us, and the military. The rest of us were not military. And we spent some time there. Later, in I'm trying to get the date straight, but in 1947, Carl was asked to help get some people opening a lab in Brookhaven. And he just moved the lab out to Long Island. And I was detailed up there for 6 months during the summer and early winter of 1948.
Hadn't you done some work on developing one of the film badges they used?
Oh yeah, we did. One of the things we did at the 2 things we did at Oak Ridge in the assembly program. The first one was we wanted to get a good calibration on them because all we had was some X-rays and we were using X-ray machines, and we were using pure standard calibrated radio sources. So we Carl knew the Bureau of Standards people, Larson Taylor, particularly who ran the X-ray division at the time, and he was Mr. X-rays and Mr. Radio Standard. So we arranged to come up to Washington, and I did this, took a whole bunch of dosimeters and both the pocket ionization chambers and the film dosimeters to Washington. And we ran them through the spectrum of their high energy. They had the 1,000,000-volt X-ray machine at the time, Cockcroft-Walton. So we gave them a constant dose of different energies and checked out the response of the film and the badge, and helped a lot in interpreting some of the film a lot later. And that's where I met Dr. Taylor, first time. I spent a
great man still alive.
Oh,
I don't see much of him.
I spent a couple weeks off and on in Washington working on that program.
Well, that was an interesting experience there.
Oh yeah. Then I went back to Oak Ridge, and Carl, as I say, had been asked to help get Brookhaven started since someone up there helped open up the program. So I agreed to go up for 6 months. I was a Southern boy, and I wasn't sure I wanted to get out of my league. But I went up and had a marvelous time working with met Fred Cowan, who ended up running the Brookhaven program.
And you later become president of Health Physics.
We helped set up the first, I concentrated on setting up the personnel monitoring program, but we did the whole works and spent spent the end of the summer of 1947.
Did Dr. Morgan send you up there by yourself to help them?
Oh yeah, no, I went up by myself.
You had to stay back there.
So I came back by this time I had kind of decided I wasn't cut out to be the research type and spend a lot of time in that work, so I was interested in programmatic work, and I transferred to the AEC, partly for money, the newly formed AEC, and I was hired by the medical division at Oak Ridge Operations Office, which was just being set up. It was still, I may have been Manhattan District employee for a while, but I ended up becoming a member of the AEC staff.
That was in 1948?
48. In the early part of 48.
We had a chance to get some live work in.
Yeah, and I worked at there and spent time with them. They were having various things that the operations office was trying to get into looking into what was going on in the field and so forth. And one of the things I did was I was sent up to Mound Lab, where they were at that time getting ready to move, or were moving into their underground facility, which they were finishing. And they had operations spread out all over Dayton, Ohio. And not only that, they were getting ready to clean them up and move them out, which they did. And that's a story that I guess it's been told somewhere, but they had in the one of the most fashionable residential areas in Dayton, they had a playhouse, which had been a swimming pool on the estate of the people that set up Monsanto Company, who ran the lab. And that's where they dissolved the slugs that they brought from Hanford, where they developed, from those, they used those to make the polonium, which we were using in their product that they produced there. And then they were in the process of still making these, because that was, at that time, was a vital part of the weapons. It was the initiator of the weapons. And, but they knew they had to move to the underground facility, which was really set up for it. So
is that where they made polonium beryllium sources that used for neutron calibration?
Yeah, they did that later. Their first thing was making polonium. They call them NEMOs. They were little things they used for initiating the weapons. Putting that burst of neutrons at the right time when the bomb went off. And they did the chemistry work for this. The heavy processing all was done in this playhouse in this big estate. And the chemistry and their actual final products were being done in the schoolhouse, which they had taken over from the Dayton School Authority. And they had agreed at that time to clean the place up and get it ready to return to school. They were just starting to do all this. And that was when I was there, and it just kind of got started. In the meantime, one day Dr. Taylor showed up down in Washington, Oak Ridge, and he was, at that time, had moved to the AEC, and he was there for a year or so on a temporary assignment to try and decide whether he wanted to leave the Bureau of Standards. And he was working that he came down to set up the fellowship program, which the AEC had established, or was established in the process of establishing, and they had wanted to set up the lab to do the training. They had the group at Vanderbilt and the OIL.
Oh, I didn't know Dr. Taylor was involved in that.
Yeah, so
I was on Old Anderson's first fellowship class.
Yeah, so I went up, so I kept, by that time I was a little bored at Oak Ridge, at the office, what I was doing. So I said, don't you need somebody in Washington that knows all about this thing? And he said, yeah, no, maybe we do. So pretty soon we had some further conversation, and I got a call from the personnel people one day telling me they were going to transfer me to Washington. So in October, I think it was the 22nd of 1948, I came to Washington, reported to the then Biology and Medicine Division, which was just getting set up. Shields had started, and they had set up something called the Biophysics Division, which Taylor was in it. Failla was involved in it in some way, right? I don't know whether under Gino Failla. But he was involved in it, but Taylor was the one that was really active in the program. And one of my first assignments was to figure out what was going on to get this fellowship program moving. And they had, the Academy of Science had selected the students. They were all in, this was now in October, and they were all in the process of being cleared. They had to get them clearances because they were going to work in the lab.
That was the first fellowship class then.
And this was the first fellowship class. So we, and Taylor had come down to Oak Ridge specifically to arrange for housing for the students and what have you. Well, we got into the program and realized that I went over and talked to Academy of Science people to find out what was going on and so forth. And they had the people's applications there, and they had a picture of everybody. Well, lo and behold, they had some minorities in the group that they had selected and already told them they were going to go to class. Well, at that time, they would not have been able to live in the dormitories in Oak Ridge because they were lily white.
I remember how it was, yeah.
And so we went back to talk to Shields' deputy, who was a very astute guy named John Bowers. So he picked up the phone. This is how easy it was to do things in those days. And called Harry Blair, who was running the lab at Rochester, and says, Harry, how would you like to have a fellowship program? He said, we'll send you some students and we'll arrange for them to go out to Brookhaven and take their training program. And that's how we got two programs going. It turned out to the best, I'm sure, at the time, but we had to, it was quite an event at the time.
We helped start that Brookhaven program, yeah.
So we started those
Manchester,
programs.
yeah, a lot of good things happened there.
And I worked with Dr. Taylor then. We did a number of things in the division. Mostly it was kind of bureaucratic work. They had no one that knew anything about the plants or the facilities or anything like that. And I was kind of the resident expert on that stuff. Dr. Taylor came to me one day and said that he had a job that he wanted me to help him do. And the Bureau of Standards had taken a contract with Taylor's group, with Los Alamos, to do measurements at the next set of weapons tests that were going to be held in the Pacific. And this was the greenhouse operation. And so he said he knew that we knew how to handle and process large numbers of films, and one of the things they had developed was a special dosimeter, which was much more accurate and so forth, and the dosimeters we were using for personnel monitoring. And they wanted me to help them set up the processing thing and so forth. So
Who developed these dosimeters, Lars and Taylor?
Yeah, they developed them at the beer stand.
Beer stands?
Yeah. So I went out and spent time with them off and on, helping set up the things. And so he said, why don't you go out in the field when they put these on and help us out? Well, I thought that was a good idea. So he talked to Dr. Warren, and he said, yeah, that'd be a good idea. I could go. So then about the same time, we learned in the early part of December, I guess, of that same year, that they were going to have a test in Nevada. They had 5 bombs they were going to shoot before they airdrop them in Nevada, before they went to the Pacific. And they wanted, this was a precursor to the work they were going to do in the Pacific. So Dr. Warren was tapped by the commission to go out and be on hand in Nevada, because there were a lot of concerns about what might happen from fallout or anything else, and the commission wanted somebody with his background down there, so he took me along with him, and we spent Walter Klaus went with him. Walter Klaus had come on board, and so Walter and I went out and stayed were there the week and a half when they exploded these 5 bombs. I came back and was here only a very short time till I went to the Pacific, and I spent 4 months, I think, or 3 or 4 months in the Pacific during the greenhouse test series. And
were you involved in film measurements in Nevada?
No. We were actually, it was kind of funny. Dr. Warren or somebody got the idea, and I think he was part of it. He may have gotten it from Stafford Warren, who was at UCLA, and he had been, of course, the Manhattan District Director.
He was a
They
physician?
had consulted him about what they were going to do and so forth.
He was a physician also?
He was also a physician. He was from Rochester. So we went to, Stafford got the idea that we ought to worry about what would happen with people if they got hit with the bombs. So he said, a lot of people riding around in cars. He says, why don't we find out what would happen to automobiles? So we got the idea, or somebody did, and we pulled it off of getting a whole bunch of clunker automobiles. There must have been a half a dozen of them. We didn't really instrument them very well because we didn't have anything to instrument them, but we put them at various distances and split during the airburst to see what would happen to the cars. And it was very interesting. Some of them, the tires burned up. Others of them, nothing happened to them. And some of them, of course, the window glass would break in some of them. And that was one of what I call one of the first civil effects type tests was done in Nevada. And it was something that kept us amused for a few days.
Right before greenhouse. Huh?
And that was before
1950, was it?
I think that was what it was. It was 50 or 51. I think it was 50.
Greenhouse, I think, was in 50.
Because
51 then.
Yeah, we only had, it was in January. And we only had a few days before, when I came back before I went to the Pacific. I was here only a very short time before we went out to the Pacific. So that was my experience starting out in nuclear testing. I came back to Washington and spent time with Bob Corsby and them had been brought on board.
They had just been brought on board after
And
greenhouse,
so,
was it?
They were brought on board, yeah, about that time.
Corsby was a great administrator, wasn't he?
Well, Corsby was a very interesting guy. He was a architect, and he had been a Navy lieutenant during the war. He was in the Seabees. And he had been sent, there was a program during the war called Strategic Bombing Survey that came on after the war. And there was a Professor Harry Bowman, who had been professor of civil engineering at MIT, who was a very, very well-known, respected civil engineer in the country. And he had run the physical division of this survey. They went over to Europe and all over the world and looked at the damage that was done by the bombs, and then made an estimate of what the weight of the bomb, the weight of the attack had done and so forth. And Harry had known Bob during that period, and Shields had talked Harry into coming down and at that time, he was dean of Drexel.
Who was?
Harry Bowman. And he talked Harry into coming down and helping set up what was to be the Civil Defense Liaison Group, support group. And so I was, talked to them a lot. I was still working for Klaus and them. And but Harry, and then he brought Bob Corsby in, who had been one of the engineers that had studied the damage in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Bob had been sent out to work with Bowman and so forth in that study. And that's how we got, that was a connection of him and getting into the effects and so forth. The group had a lot of freedom. They were formed because the Joint Committee was concerned, the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy was concerned about the tremendous effort that was being put on weapons and mass destruction, and nothing doing about what you did to protect the population or something.
Unfortunately, we still don't do nothing.
And so Harry and Bob would spend a lot of time looking over information that came in from the tests and so forth and so on. And somebody got the idea that they needed to have some shelters at Hanford because it was in the northern tier and it was close to Russia and within bomber range of Russia. So Harry and Bob cooked up a scheme to use culvert pipes to be the way to measure the bomb, to protect against the bomb, because you didn't have to be too deep in the ground, and you just had to have the right kind of doors, and they made a good shelter.
They were made of steel.
No, they were made of concrete.
Concrete culvert?
Concrete, reinforced, somewhat reinforced. So they decided to test it. So we took them out to Nevada in one of the test series.
What was the first test that they were tested on?
I don't remember. I wish I'd kept.
Probably early 50s, I think.
Yeah, I don't remember. I should have looked up this test.
We can find that out.
Yeah, I've got the test, the schedule here. The effects of nuclear weapons, if I can find one. They're all back there. But anyway, then and they also Harry and Bob had spent a lot of time working with whoever was supposed to be doing civil defense. They had a couple agencies in the government involved one time or another. And so we would see that they got information that came out of the test that was useful to them. That was their job. But this shelter test gave them an idea, because later in Upshot and Outhold, they had a very large nuclear test program where they built the houses and we built the structures, the shelters, and so forth.
Now, I believe you were very intimately involved. You were like Corsby's right-hand man, weren't you?
I was Corsby's deputy.
So you saw the whole thing. You were
we
involved in everything there.
We saw over 100 atmospheric shots in Nevada.
Yeah, you were involved in all of them.
Yeah, we had most of them. We had something going.
Plus in managing the design of the shelters and everything else.
And we had, and one of the things we did, and this is where we met a lot of the biologists. There was particularly the Los Alamos group under Wright Lamb and Payne Harris.
Great people.
And Gene Cronkite and company, who were at that time in the Navy, were doing biological tests.
So there was some of their research under your program?
Well, we provided the logistics and kept the program plugged into the right place in the test organization and so forth. And we were all worked together and were involved and funded. Most of it's funded some way by the biology medicine group. And that was our job, to keep track of all that.
And you were already in the biology and medicine.
Yeah, we were there. That we were there.
You originated there.
Yeah. So we started all that, and we did a lot of tests out there. And they had one big test where they had a shelter that they manned. The Los Alamos people were very adamant against manning shelters during man-in forward areas because they didn't want to hurt anybody. But they finally agreed to let them man one shelter during a test to do a fallout study. So they waited until they got the right thing. A tower shot would always give you some fallout, and so They got the winds just right, had it come down the shoulder, and then these guys came out with instruments and tried to see how they could clean up and get out of there and so forth. It was a good exercise, a good test. And we had to help keep the exercise where they had, they had civil defense people from all over the country in trenches once or twice at some of the tests. And they built all these houses and things, and a lot of those were ours, some of them belonged to the civil defense groups, but we were involved in all of them and instrumented a lot of them for them. By this time, we'd set up EG&G to do the instrumentation for them. We did a lot of camera work, how the structures fell apart and stuff like that. But then I came back to Washington, but ended up in a group called Radiation Instrument Branch, which Dr. Taylor had, actually I was in that before I went to Corsby, but right after the Pacific thing, they transferred a group from Oak Ridge. Had been set up to foster the development of instrumentation in the industry. This was a kind of a first cut at getting the industry business.
Was that after you already had not been involved anymore in?
No, this was before I got involved.
Before you got
after
involved.
Between that period.
Uh-huh.
And so Dr. Taylor, his work was, he was the spark plug in helping get this thing going, because the Manhattan District people wanted to keep their work focused on weapons and not on electronics and all this stuff. So all the labs had good electronics people and all, so they fostered helping them get businesses started and so forth. And we were the group that would test the instruments for them. We'd buy them from them and test them and use the Bureau Standards facilities to see if they got tested. So I worked with that group for a while. Then I joined Corsby's group.
You joined Corsby when? 50 something.
It was before the Upshot Navajo series. It was about that time. It was a test series before that, I think. The one where we tested our first shelter. And at that time, that's when we brought Sam Hurst and the guys in Oak Ridge out to do, they had come up with some ideas about neutron monitoring. That's all in the Oxford's book of Ichiban, if you want to see it. We helped.
I was involved with some of those people making the neutron.
We were trying to, by that time they were worrying about supporting the Japanese program, because the Japanese they had set up the biomedical program in Japan, but they really didn't have a good handle on radiation exposures that people had. They didn't have a good handle on what happened when the bomb went off either. They had some, but there was very little compared to what you could do now and you could do later. So we were involved in that program. That was quite the early parts of that. I was kind of the Washington godfather. Most of it was in Corsby's group, but it was all over the biomedical program. Everybody was interested.
The Radiation Instruments Group branch also supported some of that.
Well, we were, we started out in the instruments group, then went into Corsby because it was obvious that was where the field testing went on. The instrument branch eventually kind of withered away because they did their job and really finished up. But we...
well, it seems to me there was one when I came in 1957, wasn't there?
Yeah, it was there, but it was beginning to go down.
I can't remember the head of it.
Bob Butenhoff.
That's right.
Bob Butenhoff, he took a job. Bob left and went to CIA. Early parts of the CIA, and I don't know.
You know if he's still around or not?
He's dead.
He's dead.
I'm sure he's dead. And I don't remember who all they had in the group. We had a fellow named Dick Johnston, who was quite a good electrical engineer and instrument guy. And we had one technician, but he was our administrative type, was Bill Armstrong. Bill had had a unique experience because he was working as a civilian in Hawaii. He was married to a Hawaiian girl. He was working for the Navy, and he was in a small boat in Pearl Harbor when the attack occurred on Pearl Harbor. He could tell some real good stories about that. He did tell. Finally, it was hard to be able to talk about him with somebody, but he was working with us on the instrument program.
When did Chuck Dunham take over biology and medicine?
Well, Chuck took over during the days we were with the Civil Defense Group, when I was in Corsica's group. John Boer, took over from Shields Warner. And then Chuck Dunham took over. Well, I guess John Totter followed Dunham. It was Totter before Dunham.
After that,
He's after John Totter followed after that. And in all that period, one of the things we did in Nevada, which has turned out to have a lasting effect, was we realized that they had no way of really monitoring the fallout from the weapons and measuring the hot spot, or the hot line from the weapon. We had tried with various people we had a lot of people from Oakhurst from various labs come out there, and we tried to use them to cover the desert and wander around in jeeps and all kind of things. And it was all a remote area. We weren't worried about populated areas, particularly at the time. There weren't any. There was only a couple of instances where populated areas were in. But we had, we got the idea, Corsby and I, and a couple other, I guess mostly Bob and I, we found out that the AEC had paid for and was operating an airplane that had been equipped with Geiger counters and measuring instruments for uranium prospecting. And this plane was being operated by the U.S. Geological Survey. Well, after we started testing in Nevada, it kind of screwed up their background, and they couldn't do much prospecting. So we talked them into doing that for one of the test series. I guess we did for one, maybe two. Brought them on, made them part of the organization, and had them follow, and they measured the hot line. They did a very good job of it. The day after the shot, they'd go out and crisscross at 500 feet in the air, and they found the hot line and mapped it.
So that was the beginning of
That was the beginning of our aerial measuring program.
Which continues to this day, then?
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm. And we then, the aerial measuring program, it was obviously successful. And then we said, well, now what are these guys going to do between test series? So we decided to have them go to the various COE or AEC sites at the time and develop a background map around all of the sites. Mm-hmm. And they did all the AEC facilities. They did a bunch of almost every commercial reactor, and I think every one of the commercial reactors there was a map developed before any radiation was ever brought onto this site. And I had gotten this idea because one time during the period that I was still working with Taylor, with Klaus and Taylor, Idaho started it. I'm going back a little bit in time. And we decided that they needed to have a background mapping of the Idaho area. Of course, we didn't have aerial planes then. But we talked to Hanford people into coming down and doing a lot of survey work for us around. And so we actually developed a background before radiation was really brought onto the Idaho site. So I spent off and on a good part of the summer out there getting that thing going. I don't remember the year now. This might have been 40. When did that program start?
In the 50s, I think.
No, it was
the 40s already?
Before that.
Then you're going back, like you said.
Yeah, I went back. It was early. It was sometime in the 50s when I was still working with Klaus and them. Before I got into the instrument branch. But that's had given us the idea of this background survey around the facility. So the U.S. Geological Survey realized they didn't want to be our monitoring crew. That was not their cup of tea. They were interested in geology.
Mm-hmm.
And they had an airplane, and they had a magnetometer, which was not affected by radiation. So they were using it for their, that was their big thing, and they wanted to keep flying it. So Bob and I made a visit to Herb Greer, who was the last G in EG&G, named Greer. He was, it's Edgerton, Grimshausen,
Yeah.
Greer. And Herb ran the Nevada operations. So we went in one day and talked to Herb and said, we think you could take this big, god-awful setup that they had in the USGS plane. The instrumentation, incidentally, had been built by Francis Davis and these guys in Oak Ridge.
Oh yeah, J. Davis.
They had helped equip the plane for the USGS, and it was long Geiger counters and everything.
They didn't have any scintillation counters at that time.
No, they had Geiger. That's all they had. Yeah. And they had the bulky electronics.
I guess you use scintillation counters now, don't they?
Oh yeah. So these guys would look out, and they use solid state stuff too. These guys would look out and be flying along the road, and they'd mark this road, and they'd look at the instrument, and they'd mark another. That's the way they made their maps. They interpreted it. They would do their location by eyeballing, because they didn't have. They had a camera up front. They used a camera. They had a camera that followed their flight line. But it was cumbersome, and it took months to get a report. I got a letter out of them, or good report.
Was that a motion picture camera they used, or just a still?
Yeah, they had a motion picture camera.
Motion picture.
So we talked to Herb Greer about that, and he said, "Oh yeah, there's enough information around. We ought to be able to make that work." And they had, I think the GS had been USGS. It was using radar altimeters, but I'm not sure. He said, "We'll hook it up with a radar altimeter. We'll see what we can do." So he turned to a fellow named Jack Story, who's still around in G&G, somewhere in Nevada. He lives in Las Vegas. Jack did a study for us on instruments, what to do. And in fact, they concluded that they could put this on a Beechcraft Bonanza. And so we went back and talked to the powers that be. Got pretty much, again, we had a lot of flexibility. We could do about what we wanted to. The problem turned out that we couldn't, AEC couldn't own airplanes. The law wouldn't let them own a plane.
Wow.
They had to use Air Force or someone else at that time. So we went back and talked to Herb and said, we'd like to really go through with this, but we can't do it. He gave us a price. I don't know what dollars weren't that important in those days as they came later. So he said, we do this for $500,000. I don't know how much they spent doing it, but we managed to get a transfer of $500,000. And he said, he says, our contract's pretty flexible. We'll just lease a plane. We'll run it ourselves. And Herc was a pilot. He liked to fly anyway. So they went out and leased a Bonanza and equipped it with instrumentation. That was our first aerial monitoring plane. And because of the test.
So you mean the AEC could lease it, but not own it?
Well, no, contractor leased it.
Contractor leased it.
Contractor leased it. And by that time, Herb and them had split the company, and they moved a lot of that activity out to Santa Barbara. So the aerial measuring system was really in Santa Barbara, which was better equipped for it because they were doing a lot of other things. We did a lot of calibration studies on it. We did a big calibration study, and one time we got Francis Davis and the guys in Oak Ridge to make us a whole bunch of cobalt and cesium sources and put them on a string. And we took them out and spread them around the desert, and then used the plane to calibrate it at different heights and all that stuff in the water. So we did a lot of things like that to really make it work. And,
did you sometimes go up in the plane yourself?
I very seldom flew in that plane. I didn't care that much about it. We had other things to do. We had enough trouble keeping it going. But then the weapons people learned the value of it for accident response. We had been after them to look into it. And there was an incident in Mexico where the Air Force, our U.S. Air Force shot a missile from Green River, Idaho, or Green River, Wyoming, or somewhere, which was supposed to go to the White Sands, and it missed and landed down in the Mexican desert. And the Mexicans, of course, they were livid, and they thought the the DOE was, the U.S. was spying on them and all this stuff. And the instrument, the thing about it was they were doing an ablation study of the nose cone coming in, and they used a radioactive source. They had cobalt, low energy cobalt. I think it was cobalt something. It was very low energy gamma they used in this. Not cobalt 60, but very energy.
57 maybe?
It's 57 or something. It's very low energy gamma. And so the Army spent months down there trying to figure out where this thing was, and they had about come to their wits' end. I got a call one day from the Pentagon saying, you guys think this airplane could help us out? I said, well, I don't know. I said, I'll check it out. So I had sense enough to go up and see the general manager at the time, the AEC. I said, we got this call. He said, well, do whatever you want to, but he says, make the Air Force or the Department of Defense make all the arrangements. Says, we don't want any arrangements for us to have to worry about crossing the border. So they said, fair enough, we'll take care of it. So one weekend, one Friday afternoon, the guys got in the plane in Las Vegas and flew it down to Mexico. And they went out on Saturday and did a little flying around. By this time they had a good navigation systems. They'd put beacons out and everything. They carried their own systems with it so they could plot and make an accurate map. And they came back in kind of grinning. And the next day, they took the window out of one side of the plane, and they put 5-pound flour sacks in there. And they flew out and led the ground crews to this, right where this crater was, where this thing occurred. And it was a real coup because Monday morning they cleared customs coming back to the U.S. And the military had spent weeks down there wandering all around with instruments, couldn't find this thing. So we were talking to the EG&G guys later and said, well, you guys are so smart and you see these low energy gammas, why don't you go up to the test site and fly those areas where they had done the plutonium one-shot tests in one spot. They did a bunch of tests up there where they tested only one detonator.
Yeah.
So they said, oh yeah, okay, well, so they did, and sure enough, they could see this.
What did they see? Plutonium doesn't give off much. What did they see?
It's a 57, the gamma rays from
Neptunium.
Or americium.
Americium has a 60 keV.
Yeah, they could see that.
Wow.
And so they made the maps of it. So after that, we got the military guys, and we went over and talked to them, and they said, oh yeah, we got to get in on this. So after that, they provided a lot of support and effort for the plane. So, and it eventually was put over pretty much in the military application program. We had a lot of fun with that. We also mapped the one up in New Jersey. I noticed it was in the newspaper recently where they had a Bomark missile that went awry, and it blew up, and there was a plutonium warhead on the missile. And it spread plutonium all over. It was part of Camp Dix. And so we got involved in it when the Air Force wanted to get rid of the land and give it back to the Army, which had been originally Fort Dix, and they had put this place out. The Army said, we're not going to take it till you clean it up. And so,
I don't remember that. Was that in the news or is it kept quiet?
It made the news, but not much. It made the news recently. There was still some going around. So we got the guys ginned up, and they went out and mapped that thing and found out that the cleanup had not been as successful as people expected. And it had really gotten off site. They thought they'd confined everything to the concrete pad, and all they had washed off into a drain out in the desert. And it's not desert up there, but all the land around the site. So we had fun with that one. But that's when the military people really got on board, and we went from there. And one of the biggest uses we made of the plane was for the military was when a Russian submarine caught on fire in the Pacific, nuclear sub. And I got a call from the Pentagon guys, the nuclear Navy guys, which we knew pretty well. They wanted to know if we could help them out. And we said, well, I don't know, we'll see. And, you know, EG&G had equipped the system so that they could move it in a hurry. And they had a plan always established to fly away to wherever they needed it from Nellis Air Base. And so we said, well, it'd be a good test of that. So we went through a lot of high-level negotiations for about 24 hours, and they loaded the plane in Las Vegas, and they loaded a plane in Las Vegas. The gear was, by this time, had been designed to fit on military helicopters. They loaded all the gear on military helicopters. They loaded all on a transport plane, flew to Hawaii and landed and had an intelligence briefing and took off to Okinawa. And they wanted to catch the submarine before it went out into the Straits of Hormuz. Once they passed that, they were pretty much Russian air cover, and they figured the Russians would harass them. And they put it on.
Well, the submarine was above ground, I guess. It was, wow.
Beg your pardon?
I mean, it was above the water. It was all
Oh yeah, it was up above the water. Guys were on deck and all. They had real troubles with it.
Yeah.
So our guys got that. They went out and flew the thing and got a lot of good data. I never got into what they returned, but I know the Navy was pretty happy with it.
What were they trying to measure?
Well, what they could find out about the submarines and what had happened to the plane. They had reactor problems to the
They
submarine.
were measuring radiation from the submarine?
You better believe it. We could also tell which railroad cars had weapons on them and which didn't when we flew the planes around.
Oh, you didn't think it'd be that sensitive.
It was extremely sensitive, so we did a lot of that kind of stuff.
They had a large bank of GM tubes initially or something?
Oh, they were using scintillation counters, and they
Later on
they used a rate of germanium. I don't know what they
And then
used.
later, what's that? The simulation counters didn't come along for what, late 50s or something?
Well, yeah, but this was all later. This was
Mhm.
we had a lot of fun with that.
So you're going into the 60s now, I guess. You were still in biology and medicine?
I
or
left biology and medicine
when?
in the late, I think it was about 59 or something like that.
Yeah?
The atmospheric testing was over and so forth. And I got a chance to go down to the Operational Safety Division. Martin Bowles came in one day and said, hey, Bob Catlin's leaving. How about, I think you ought to apply for his job. I said, oh, all right, I'm willing to take it.
Bob Catlin, he must have come down there.
Bob was the assistant director for health protection.
That was after he was at Westinghouse in Pittsburgh, wasn't it?
He was it before that. Yeah,
Yeah.
he'd been in the AEC, but he came down and worked for them.
How long was that? That must have been what, late 60s?
The late 60s, I guess.
The late 60s already.
Well, anyway, I went down in, I think it was 69 that I went down there, if I remember right. And I went down and we worked there, and at that time then we transferred the aerial measuring program into the operational safety because it was really an emergency response capability. And one of our areas was emergency response. So we went down and started working there, and the first thing that happened to me when I got in is Martin Bowles came in one day, and he was the director of the division. Said, we've just been handed $5 million to clean up Grand Junction, Colorado. And he says, you're going to have to figure out how to make this work. But he says, you can't spend all your time on it because there's other things you have to do. So we were, that program had been approved by Congress, and nobody in the AEC wanted to touch it. And they didn't want to have the job of cleanup, so they signed it to us.
You mean the Grand Junction?
The Grand Junction,
Mill?
No, the mill tailings around the town. In
Around
Grand
the town.
Junction, what had happened, the townspeople with a lot of encouragement,
Mm-hmm.
or certainly no reason to stop them, had used those tailings for fill-ins
Oh my gosh,
basements and all
Oh
kinds
my
of
gosh.
high schools, the whole works.
So, you know something? One of the first things Forest Western asked me to do when I came with the commission in 1957, before Vic Beard came as my branch chief, was to look into that and recommend what to do with the tailings.
Yeah.
And I remember I wrote a memo recommending they not be used for that sort of thing. The only thing they should be used for would be maybe in the roads out in the desert or something where people are going by fast.
They had already done it. They did it big time.
Apparently my
And
memo
so-
didn't make any impact.
And the state of Colorado Health Department had stirred the problem up and gotten it before Congress. And
Yeah.
gotten it. So we got the job of making it work. Jim Schlesinger had just come in as chairman of the AEC when all this was going on.
Tough job, I guess.
And, well, it was interesting for me because I had never had to deal with the public. You know, we'd
Yeah.
all dealt with the bureaucracy or the
Right.
contractor.
Uh-huh.
And so we had to figure out a way to deal with the public and get this to work. So we went out, and one of the lawyers and I went out to Las Vegas, Grand Junction, and talked to them and decided that the way to make it work was to hand it off to the Grand Junction office, which was a pretty good office, and they had some people there who knew about mill tailings because they had been part of the raw materials program. They knew a lot about the uranium and so forth. So they were closing that, a process of closing that office. So we managed to preserve a few positions for them, of key people that we wanted. And then we talked with the state of Colorado and agreed that we had to have a joint program. It had to be, the law called for it to be, they call it a compact, which is essentially a contract between the two agencies. And this required the state to put up 25% of the cost, and the feds were putting up 75%. And so we got the agreements from the state and to do this and so forth, and we told them they'd have to get an AE contractor to run this. And these guys we were dealing with says, what's an AE? They were that naive about big contracting work and so forth. So there was a local Colorado firm that had been doing some work there. We turned that off.
Architect, engineer.
Yeah. Nelson,
Firm, huh?
and Nelson, Haley, and Quirk or something like that was the name of it.
They actually tried to tear down some civilian homes?
They went in and just jacked the houses up and took the foundations out and put new ones in. They did a number of things.
And people had already lived in those homes?
They were living there, yeah. State rented a bunch of apartments and they took people out long enough to clean them up.
Wow.
And the big cleanup was one of the schools, the Central High School.
How bad was it? I mean, what were the radiation levels?
It was in some cases tens or hundreds of microarc per hour in some cases.
What was the radon was a big problem too?
Now a lot of the areas, like the basements, some of the houses, they just go in and put plastic, a good thick coat of this.
It was mainly the radon that was the problem coming in?
Yeah, they wanted to fix that.
There wasn't that much direct radiation, mainly the
No,
radon?
it was all radon coming in. And there was some direct, but not much. But some of them, the ones that didn't have too much, they just used in the basement. They put this in and it would kill the radiation. At the high school, they actually we went in, they spent more than $5 million cleaning that up. I don't know how much we spent. But they went in and took the first floor out and took little mining cats in there and mined the tailings out and replaced them with clean sand. That's how they cleaned the high school up. And,
Big job.
Fortunately, they didn't use it much in the mortar. So there wasn't much of that around. There was some, but not a lot. But we did a huge cleanup. And that started all
I guess you had to go out and supervise some of that, huh?
Well, we spent an awful lot of time in the plateau area. And so
Was that written up? Was there reports on that?
Oh, there's a lot of reports around. I don't have.
Would they still keep those in the
They
Department of Energy library?
they're probably in the library or something. We brought in the team from Oak Ridge early on, Oxford's team and the guys too. One of the things we tried to get was some idea of what a cleanup, what would be clean. You know, we get the question, how clean is clean? And we didn't know what the background of radium was. We consulted Robley Evans was the big man on radium. We had Robley down there several times who worked with us. He was one of our advisors. And so we finally got the idea. We got involved with Salt Lake City. There was a big pile in Salt Lake, and they wanted that cleaned up. And now they hadn't used it much in Salt Lake City like they had in Grand Junction. Grand Junction was the worst place. There was a little bit in some of the other towns, but not anything like on the scale of Grand Junction.
Was Grand Junction a big town?
No, I don't know, it's a fairly good little town. I have no idea how big it was, but it's a small town, yeah, small town. And but in Salt Lake City, we brought Oxer and his team out and made a series of lines up and down the valley and managed to sample the soil and got an idea of what the background of the radium was in the soil. So we knew.
Were those tailings from what?
There was a huge mill. That was a huge mill in Salt Lake City.
In Salt Lake City.
It was out by the
Uranium mill.
Uranium mill, that's correct.
Were there mines up near there?
Oh yeah, I don't know where they came from. The mines are all around there. And we tried to get the raw materials people at one time to reprocess the damn things and take the radium out. And they didn't want to fool with it. So we ended up they ended up eventually moving the pile 50 miles up in the desert somewhere in a sink and covering it over. By that time we were out of it. We didn't want to stay into that business. But out of that grew the decontamination and the cleanup part of the operational safety program. It wasn't part of our baseline.
There we are. We're on again.
During the course of all this career, I've had occasion to meet some very interesting and famous people. One of them we met early on was Sandra Glaston, who was the famous author,
physical seeing him around. I think I've known him.
He was a physical chemist.
Yeah.
He was brought into Los Alamos sometime during the end of the war to write their monthly reports from him. He was a writer, and we engaged him to write the effects of nuclear weapons.
So you had something to do with that? Huh?
Oh yeah. And the last one, the final version, which was 1962. I was the project officer on the book for Sam. And that was one of the most fascinating periods we had, was working with Sam, because he was just like a sponge. You could give him some of the most irrelevant information you have ever seen, and he'd come out with the most lucid chapter of all this stuff, and organized and well written. He was just terrific.
He had been a professor, hadn't he?
Yeah, he was from England. He wrote the classic book on physical chemistry.
Mm-hmm.
For years. I don't know whether it's still in use, but it used to be one of the classics. And somewhere later on he started doing these books. So he wrote the effects of nuclear weapons. He did the first one, the effects of atomic weapons, which I was not involved with top Corsby and them at the time, but they were involved with it. He put that out. We worked a lot with the Los Alamos people on both of those. And so Sam was one of the more colorful characters we ran into, because he had a terrible temper. And if you ever triggered him off, you'd have to spend a week calming him down before it went on. I never was the butt of his temper myself, but I know some people who were, and he took off after Corsby a couple times. But they got along all right. Sam would sit down and fire off a letter to the general manager of the AEC, whoever somewhere I have a file of some of Glaston's letters, which were priceless. The other one, which was extremely...
When did Corsby leave? When did he leave the commission? Right after the test stopped?
Yeah, about the time the testing stopped.
He didn't live very long after that, did he?
No, he was, unfortunately, he was killed in a house fire. He and his wife and son.
Not too many years after he left AEC?
About a year or so after that.
It's tragic.
He went to with a very successful architect engineering firm in New York, people he'd worked with before. And he was a partner with them. They do a lot of stuff. And Bob, his he had bought a big house up in Oslo, and he was somehow they had a fire, and he and his wife were killed, and a teenage son. It was
a fireplace thing, wasn't it?
well, I don't know. It was furnaces. No, he had a couple furnaces in the house. It was a big place.
Was it that his son that they thought made of?
And I don't know what happened, how it got started. The fire department people came in. People saw the fire inside, and they came in and opened, knocked some windows out and so forth, and that put a lot of oxygen in there, and things took place in a hurry. But by that time, he and Alvin were dead. And it was a sad occasion. We never quite understood. They had an investigation, but there was no indication of foul play. The only problem that bothered people was the teenage son who was mind-blowing, and he was in one of the bathrooms, and his hands were all burned, and they were wondering whether he had something to do with it too. He was killed. He was asphyxiated. They were all asphyxiated. They didn't, the flames did the asphyxiation. They killed him. And but they never quite explained it. But that was the Bob left after that. The other really interesting character was Eugene Wakeman.
I met him.
We during my days there in the Civil Effects Group, Alvin Weinberg wanted to bring that Nobel Prize winner Eugene Wigner back to Oak Ridge. Wigner had been there at one time. In fact, when I was in one of the years I was still at the lab, they brought him down as director of the lab.
Wigner?
Yeah, for about a year.
He was professor at Yale, wasn't he?
No, he was professor. I don't know where he was. Princeton.
Oh, Princeton.
And so Eugene, here comes the kids in. Eugene was I'll finish this up. Alvin Weinberg wanted to bring Eugene back, and this was after he won the Nobel Prize, to the lab. And Eugene's, by this time, was interested in civil defense. He had become very concerned about the fact that all of our efforts were towards offense and none against protection.
He was also have more success because we still don't have it.
But he was also concerned that there were technical problems that could be addressed in the civil defense area, and they weren't being addressed. So he and Alvin came up and sold the AEC commissioners on setting up a program to do this. I ended up being the Washington godfather of this program. And my job was to keep track of what they were doing and keep the commissioners informed of what was going on.
What year was this?
Oh gosh.
70s, I guess.
Yes, it was the 70s. I've got some reports on that, but I don't have them.
Yeah. Well, that's probably on the record, I guess.
Yeah. Anyway, we started out. This was before I went to operational safety, so it was in the 60s.
Did Wigner leave Princeton altogether?
No, he just took leave and he'd come down.
For a while.
They set him up an apartment in Oak Ridge. And he went down there, and Alvin formed a group to work with him. And they did a number of very useful and interesting things. They started looking at the trade-offs between active and passive defense, and what would happen if you used a shelter. This was the big jargon with these defense guys at the time. This was the McNamara Pentagon and these bright guys he had over there, and they were talking about cost effectiveness and all this stuff. It was cheaper to build bombs and dig holes and protect people. They would say things like this, and some of them public, but most of them.
Yeah, if they just convinced everybody to build one house was going up, it would have done the trick. We tried to sell that when I was in civil defense. 57.
Yeah.
50,
Well,
56, 57.
well, that was really before those guys got involved. That was the 70s. Anyway, Wigner did a lot of work with he took on these guys that made these arguments, and he shut them up on that cost effectiveness. And I remember I was in the Pentagon one day at a meeting and the Institute for Defense Analysis people, they were the big ones. They were the guys that were touting this, active defense was more cost effective, and therefore we should put our efforts. And they had this big chart on the wall and all this math and so forth and so on. So it gave us a big briefing. I listened to all this, and going down the hall afterwards, I said, Eugene, something didn't sound right about that briefing to me. But I said, I didn't understand any of that math. He says, well, it didn't matter. He said the math was all wrong anyway. So he went back and wrote a paper and just a stinging rebuke, and it just killed that whole idea right away. They got off that kick. But
well, it had to be either or. What is their active defense? Missiles, you mean?
yeah, bombs delivered by missiles or by airplanes or what have you. But Wigner, he got the idea they needed to look at this problem in some detail. So they got the Academy of Science to set up a summer period up in Woods Hole. And he had all these people up there, and they reviewed the problems and talked about it and so forth. They had a couple good reports on them called Harbor reports. They had a fancy house that was owned by one of the Vanderbilts, I think, that the Academy of Science used at least for work, and that's where they did the study. It was on a thing called Little Harbor, so they called this thing Harbor Report, and I got to spend a lot of time on that. And to say it was one of the really fascinating periods to hear. We did some interesting things down there. We had a fellow named Conrad Chester who was quite a character who worked for the laboratory. And Conrad, very bright. And Conrad began to look at the vulnerability of nuclear power plants to a weapon hit. And he actually built small scale models of some of the plants, and blew them up with explosives, and found that they were really very hard beasts, that you'd have more problems with the radioactivity from the bombs that they would use to knock the plants out than you would from the spread of the activity from the fallout from the weapons, the reactor itself. And they did a lot of studies similar to that. One of them they did, which was that in those days, you probably don't remember it, but they had a program where they were going to kill airplanes in the air, high altitudes, by shooting up nuclear weapons. And small weapons turn them loose because there's no the mean free path of radiation is very, very long, and you get the pellets of radiation basically causing so they couldn't complete the mission. But some of the guys started looking at it, and they found out that was a great idea, but there was some effects that the lab people that he dug up with him, we had a problem with it, because this put a huge electromagnetic pulse on the ground, and if the power lines picked this up, you could knock out one hell of a lot of your power system in the country. You probably wouldn't damage it irrevocably, but when we went over and talked to TVA about it, they said, "Oh my God!" He said, "That's like hitting the whole system at one time with lightning." He says, "We can take a few strikes," because we can't take that many. He said, "We'd be down for God knows how long." So they did some studies on that, and that we never heard a whole lot more about that program. I don't know what happened to it, but it had some merit. The program itself was effective as far as defense, but there were things you had to understand, and these were the consequences. So Wigner's people did that, and we did a couple big studies. But he was just a delightful guy to work with, and I remember we went one time to Livermore, and Edward Teller was there, and the director of Livermore was a guy named Mike May. Wigner had been doing a study of defending New York City. They'd had some engineers look at the problem, and they had decided that you could go down deep under the city and build shelters up and down the streets, and build tunnels, and there was plenty of rock, and you could do this thing. And you could use those as parking garages later on, have a dual purpose, as parking and so forth. So they were looking into this problem. They had some engineers working with them and so forth, Eugene and